Hello everyone, and welcome back to AP Bio with AP Playground. Today we're covering topic 7.10, speciation. Today we'll be describing the conditions under which new species may arise, talking about both allopatric and sympatric speciation, and also describing the rate of evolution in speciation under different ecological conditions. Suggested skills are going to be visual representations to be, explain relationships between characteristics of biological models in both theoretical and applied contexts, and also argumentation 6e, predict the causes or effects of a change in or disruption to one or more components in a biological system. So, speciation is the process by which one species splits into multiple species. So it's the process by which new species are created. And a species is a group of populations whose members have the potential to breed and produce viable and fertile offspring. So the offspring must be able to survive and also reproduce. And speciation is focused on reproductive isolation. And these are biological barriers that prevent members of two species from producing hybrids, which is a combination of species. So essentially, when there are barriers that prevent reproduction, then two species have been created. Because a species is a group of populations whose members have the potential to breed and produce fertile offspring. So if breeding is no longer possible, that means that you have created two separate species. These populations are no longer one species. So reproductive barriers are barriers that prevent reproduction from occurring and producing viable and fertile offspring include both prezygotic and postzygotic barriers. And prezygotic barriers prevent mating or hinder fertilization. So they're before the zygote is formed. They prevent the zygote from being formed. And first up is habitat isolation. This is location based. If individuals are not in the same location, then they cannot breed. There's no reproduction, therefore they're part of different species. Behavioral isolation. If these individuals cannot send the right signals to each other that will result in mating, then there's no reproduction. These are separate species. An example are the blue-footed boobies, which have to do a dance with their blue feet in order to gain a mate. And if they don't do this, then and if the species is unable to do this, that means that it is not part of the blue-footed booby species, that no reproduction has occurred. There's also temporal isolation. If two individuals cannot breed because they do not they're not on the same mating cycle, like they breed in different seasons, then that means no reproduction will occur. These are separate species. If there's mechanical isolation, if the anatomy doesn't match up and allow breeding, then no reproduction. These are different species. And lastly, gametic isolation. If even after mating occurs, zygotes cannot be formed, so the sperm cannot fertilize the egg, no zygote is formed, then again, these are going to be separate species. And now we're going to discuss postzygotic barriers. These are barriers that happen after a zygote has been formed that still prevent the zygote from being viable, so maturing or being fertile, meaning it can have its own offspring. So we have reduced hybrid viability, where development is going to cease and the offspring cannot mature, the hybrid cannot mature. We have reduced hybrid fertility, where the offspring is sterile, and so the hybrid is unable to have children. And then we have hybrid breakdown, where the offspring of hybrids are weak and sterile. So even though the hybrid may be able to have its own children and survive and reproduce, the offspring are not going to be able to do so. And an example of reduced hybrid fertility is going to be the mule. And the mule comes from the mix of a horse and donkey, and that's why these are different species, because their offspring is not going to be fertile. A mule is going to be a sterile organism. And now we're going to discuss types of speciation. And here we're focusing on two main types, allopatric and sympatric speciation. So allopatric speciation is going to be habitat isolation based. There's geographical isolation, and that's going to prevent gene flow and reproduction within these populations that is eventually going to cause the speciation to happen and two species to emerge. And so when populations become isolated, then all of a sudden we have different altering of gene pools, and we're going to have speciation occur. And this happens through geographic occurrences. So for instance, over here we can see erosion has caused a valley and a river to form in the middle of this landscape, and as a result we now have two different species of trees, because these trees can now not all reproduce with one another. And so this is generally going to be slow speciation. It's not going to happen overnight because it's based on natural geographic events. and then natural selection is going to occur, and there will be selection against hybrids, resulting in speciation. Now, sympatric speciation, on the other hand, is behavioral isolation, and this is reproduction that doesn't happen because of behaviors resulting in new species, such as sexual selection, and that is when organisms some are better suited to find a mate, and so if behaviors change so that within the populations there can no longer be finding a mate, that means that there's going to be no reproduction happening, and we're going to see speciation. If resources change, that's going to cause behavioral changes in organisms trying to get those resources, and that behavioral isolation could also contribute to sympatric speciation, and this generally happens a lot faster. And an example here is going to be polyploidy in plants, which is where non-disjunction of chromosomes occurs within plants, and as a result, they cannot breed with diploid members and produce fertile offspring because they have a different number of chromosomes, because non-disjunction has occurred. And lastly, we have to discuss hybrid zones, which are places where species can meet. There's not a complete reproductive barrier. And what can happen at these hybrid zones are one of three things. Either the barrier is going to become reinforced, so this reproductive barrier is going to become solidified. These species can fuse and become one if the barrier is not so strong, or the hybrids will become stabilized. So the barrier will remain, but the offspring will become more viable and fertile. Last up for today is discussing rates of evolution and speciation. And so here we're talking about divergent evolution, where adaptation to new habits results in phenotypic diversification. So as new habitats emerge and different traits are selected for these habitats, we're going to have diversifying phenotypes within the species, and that's eventually going to cause speciation. And so we're looking at adaptive radiation, where many new species arise from a single common ancestor due to many new niches available to be filled. So for instance, if there's an extinction that occurs, all of a sudden there are a lot more roles within the environment that can be fulfilled, and speciation will occur as different individuals that are phenotypically different are going to be filling those roles and surviving and reproducing, and that's going to speed up speciation. There's also punctuated equilibrium, where we see periods of stasis followed by sudden change. So there's going to be no speciation occurring, and then all of a sudden there's going to be sudden evolution and speciation, compared to gradualism, where there's gradual evolution over time. And this compares to convergent evolution, in which case the same structures with the same function are going to evolve because of similarity in environment. So over here we see in divergent evolution, we're going from a common ancestor into fox and domestic dog. Speciation has occurred as these different wolves are filling different roles within the environment and have different traits that make them better adapted to different parts in the environment. Whereas in convergent evolution, there's no winged common ancestor, but birds have evolved wings, butterflies have evolved wings, and bats have evolved wings, because all of those allow them to better survive within their environment. So there are lots of different ways that evolution and speciation can occur, but adaptive radiation is definitely going to speed up speciation, and evolution can either occur punctuated or gradual. And so reviewing speciation, you need to know your prezygotic and postzygotic barriers, and that when reproductive barriers occur, that means speciation has occurred. And so we're looking at allopatric, which is geographic, and sympatric, which is behavioral speciation. And lastly, you should know about the rates of speciation that arise through divergent evolution. We'll see you in 7.11.